just so you all know, there's people talking in my ear right now, so sometimes I give strange looks. It's because people are talking in my ear. So, and generally when I do a panel and like I hang out with these guys, well, I think more so Martin than Kevin, but I usually end up having to give up halfway through, and then Martin kind of helps take over.
Yeah.
So how many writers we have out there?
Put it back in the air.
Back in the air? Nice. Awesome. Yeah.
How many readers do we have out there?
Very nice.
Literacy.
So unfortunately, I side on the side that's I'm a writer that I haven't written as much lately, but I am lacking in the reading area right now. So shame, I need to be on that. But yeah, Martin, Kevin, thank you guys for being here. Is Amanda joining us, or is she at the table?
She's at the table.
She's got a commission, man, already.
True.
The show's off to a great start too, by the way.
It really is.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, thank you guys for being here. It's been a good time so far, and we're just gonna shake this thing off.
Shake it off, man. Let's go. These people want to know about crafting a story.
So, one of the things, I mean, sticking through something like that, it takes a lot. I mean, it's, I've finished a short story, and that was one of the first things. I've worked on several novels on my own, and it was one of the first things I took and actually like pushed through to actually work on the editing process and make this short story happen, because it was such a process to get it there. And today we can just talk about a little about getting to the point of crafting, like where, some of you may be who's at the beginning of their story, who just has an idea and they just want to know what to do with it. So Martin, Kevin, can you guys just kind of chime in? What would you give them, just some encouragement on, so they have this story, they have this idea, they're watching their favorite TV show and they just got this like little bit of thing, or they're reading their favorite book and they get this idea off that. Like, how do they move forward? What are some good tips on that?
Take notes on your ideas. Don't let them evaporate. Record them. You've got a notes function on your iPhone. I use it all the time. If I get some weird, stupid idea that I think I might turn into a story, I always tap a sentence or two just in there to remind me. Then I can go in and see that, because if I'm busy, if I'm driving somewhere, if I'm at work, my day job, I may lose that. And there's a lot going on, so you want to record those things and save them for later.
Right.
That'd be the first thing I would suggest, just something very simple and practical.
Yeah.
My thing is this: with the few stories I've written, and when I write a story, I start off with what I want to say. Not necessarily like I have an idea. Like I believe that Coke is the best soda. I actually do. So I want to write a story letting everybody know that Coke is the best. Hypothetical, obviously, I wouldn't do that. So I start off with that idea. Like I want the world to know that Coke is the best. So then I form my story around these robots that battle for soda, and it's that. So I always start with the bigger idea when I start a story.
Right.
And then that's how decisions came to be. It was like I want to tell this about these topics, these issues, and then I form the story around it. What you said about watching TV, that can be dangerous. I go back to the first book I ever wrote, Arthur the Legend Continues, and Lost was big at the time. And I'm reading it now, I'm like, there's a lot of Lost in this. So I let my outside sources kind of influence me too much while I was working on that. So you gotta be careful with that.
Right. Well, and I think kind of on a little bit of both, like on what you were saying, the reason I mentioned watching TV, I was actually, one of the book ideas I've had in the most recent years, I was watching The Walking Dead, and one of my favorite books is 1984. So I had this idea that came to my head that was this crazy cross between the two, and that's one that's in the works, But I had this crazy idea that kind of came this society that, like, what if that's the only way you could survive? And that was, you're in the zombie apocalypse, so to live like the 1984 book, like, is your way to thrive as a civilization again. So it was through watching that book, it was kind of with that book idea, and it was this weird mashup,
Oh, yeah.
But I agree. I mean, I remember you talking about Arthur, and you saw those similarities in what you were watching, and some of the first things you guys make, I mean, it's gonna be some of the stuff you're into. It's gonna have a lot of,
Well, I think something you should be into.
That's gonna happen. Yeah.
Like, I'll never write a story about Pepsi, but I'll always write
What about the language and the words you use?
What about the language?
How you describe things. That's the problems I have.
Well, a lot of that lies on what your educational background is, what you know. I mean, if obviously studying other authors and studying other writers, you can pick up on that. But like I'm not well educated. My son, who's here, has 4 times the education I have, and probably a better writer than I am. So I end up crutching on that a little bit, like looking at other writers for inspiration for that sort of stuff, because I don't really have the educational background of somebody who's my vocabulary is only so big, because public school, and then I went to an art college. not a lot of focus on the vocabulary there. So I know for me that's something I do struggle with a little bit as far as the language and the vernacular. How about you?
I don't worry about it up front when I'm initially writing a story. I want to get the story down, and then I'll come back and editing, proofing to address those sorts of things. And I mean, I'm not ashamed to use a thesaurus if I come up against something where I think I need a different term. I mean, use use the resources, the practical resources that you have. But to me, if I'm trying to technically address specific words or specific language when I'm initially writing, it's going to hamper the story development to me. To me, that sort of stuff, like I say, comes into editing. You're like your second or third run on your story, as opposed to when you're first getting your draft down. To me, it's more important to get the dynamics of the story, to get the flow of the arcs and what I'm trying to get across, than it is to get into the specific language of it. So that would be my recommendation. And also, I would recommend for anybody that wants to write anything to read Stephen King's On Writing, because he addresses those sorts of things in very practical and kind of funny ways that are very helpful.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I can get stuck on, I'm sure you guys have too, is some of those details. Like, we get these ideas as writers and people that have these creative minds, and we try to this is just such a cool, if I was reading this would be the cool thing. This person's got an awesome name and it means this, and this is where it's going to feel in the story, and it was fate, and it, but then you're like, but the story has no depth to it. There's nothing there. Oh, I should maybe work on that.
You can get too caught up in that trying to develop, this name means this, and if you check the old English dictionary, and it's like, was there any point to that really at the end of the day?
Right, and that's the stuff we have to fight. I mean, that's, if you really want to dig through, especially if you're working on a novel, it's work. It's a lot of work, and you can get so hung up, and some of it for me, honestly, is fear. I get so worked up about what's going to happen next. I get stuck on something because I really am afraid to move forward. So I just want to stick. Well, I'm going to work over this chapter 30 times, and I'm going to keep working it, and I'm going to keep working it, and then it's like, oh yeah, it's been 6 months and I've written a chapter. It's like,
well, that goes to what you mentioned before about plotting your arc out. I'm a believer in don't start writing if you don't know how it's going to end, because you're going to get lost in the process. You have to. You start. This is my story. This is the climax. I have to get from here to there. So as a writer, I'm always getting there, and then you'll go back in and you'll trim.
Right.
But if you don't know how it ends, you could end up. I'm writing a 6-issue miniseries. It's now 47 issues because I didn't know how to end it, and it just kept going. So, in my opinion, I don't know about you.
I agree. But sometimes the ending can change as you write the story.
Oh, yeah.
But I do agree that you want to know where your story's going. You want to have an idea of how it should end and where you want your characters to be at the end. But as you write those characters, you develop that story, don't be afraid to let the ending change because you had an epiphany in the middle of the writing process. That's the beauty of writing, is that it's not just this rote process from one to the other. You're not writing a 9th grade essay. You're writing something that you want to flower and bloom and turn into something bigger than what you started with. And it always does. And eventually the ending points, the plot points at the end that you want to be there will be there, but they may change and get better and have more depth and variety than you initially anticipated.
Massive
very different. Yeah.
I'm gonna let you guys take the difference on that.
Well, my background was television writing, which is closer, or script writing, which is closer to comic books. But even that, the learning curve from writing for film and TV to writing for a comic is massive. And I imagine, adversely, from a novel to a comic, it's the same. Writing for comics is its own thing. Whatever you think you've learned about writing, it's not going to be 100% applicable to comics. I learned that right away.
Yeah, because you're writing a set of instructions for an art team to communicate your story that way. The dialogue is different, but in terms of what you're actually putting on your laptop, you're telling a whole different set of artists what to do, a whole different set of professionals, and then you have to pace it for a page count. A novel can be as many pages or as few as you want it to be, but a comic usually has a set page count for financial reasons when you talk about printing.
And talent.
Absolutely. So the differences are very technical. But when you get into the storytelling, you've got to be more structured with a comic, I think, because your artists may be different in terms of personality and the way they work, and you have to kind of know that to know how to communicate what they should put on the page. And you have to know how your page should end and how the next page should begin. And that's never a consideration in a novel.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've dabbled a little bit in both, and it's a different beast. Like it's almost relearning kind of how you think about, because I went from novels to working on comic kind of script, and that was and then worked on some TV or movie scripts. So it's all very.
And a big difference with comics, novels, and television as well is with comics is your landscape is a lot smaller. Like you said, your page count's lower, but your landscape for dialogue is smaller. You have to be very. You have to exercise. You got to cut. You got to be very with a scalpel, cutting your dialogue to what's important to the story. Because you start filling these word balloons with too many words, and it loses what a comic is.
The beauty of comics is that the story should come through the pictures, and the words accent what's coming through the pictures.
And when I first started coming from TV, that was a trap I had. Like, again, going back to reading that first Arthur, there's just way too much dialogue, and I didn't trust the artist. I didn't know to take my story and put his spin on it. I was like, well, draw this panel like that. I'm going to fill it with all the word balloons. So again, you can pretty much black out half the pictures in the Arthur book and still know what's happening. And that was a mistake I did in the beginning because I hadn't quite made it over that learning curve yet.
So Martin, when your first script that you wrote for an artist, how long were your panel descriptions?
Massive.
A panel description should be a few sentences at most. I know mine were paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
I was writing an essay for each panel, and it's ludicrous. There's no way an artist can interpret that into something coherent that's going to keep their sanity intact.
Yes.
Right. Well, and I was kind of doing the same thing, but I would be like, this is what the panel is, and then there'd be a paragraph of just trying to explain, like, well, this is what I mean by this and that, and like they were never reading all that.
When you get into, I want the hand gesture to be this way, and I want this facial expression. I'm going to be looking at this over here and this happening in the background.
Yeah.
You got to. The beauty of comics is that it's like a mind meld between different artists, writers, artists, colorists, and so forth. And you want them to bring their own spin to the story, their own intelligence, their own background, their own take on the story to what you're creating. And so you give them a basic setup for what the panel should be, for what the page should represent, and then they get to run with it. And you'd be surprised how much more fulfilling that is than dictating to somebody, draw this and only this.
And when we get back to the whole crafting the story thing, but a little bit more on comics, Kevin and I, we're in charge of our companies. So we're the editors as well. I'm correct, right? So
editors, letters,
you name it.
Yeah,
but with
marketers,
with not normal comics, but more mainstream comics, you'll turn your script in, and that's it. The editor's in charge of what. So you have to be willing to let that go a little bit. But to what we were also talking about, the panels and the learning curve. I think it was John Byrne I heard talking about it. He was working on a script, and the script was Hawkman flies across the room between some guy's legs and lands in the alley. It was too much description. That's the thing you have with writing comics. You have to learn. Only so much can happen in a panel. You start packing too much action into the panel, and it's impossible to draw. Like, you can't have Hawkman flying across a room under a guy's legs and then doing another action in the same panel, because it won't make sense. It'll just be Hawkman will be on the same panel. It can't work. So a learning curve with that also is the language of comics. What you can put in a panel or not. It's a snapshot. It's as if you just took a photograph, and that's all you get. You can't do too much action. So again, it's a learning curve, man. My recommendation when I first started to figure this out was Marvel Civil War was big at the time. Who wrote that?
Mark Miller.
Mark Miller. I downloaded his things. I downloaded his script online. You can find all these scripts online. And I held it next to the comic. And I did also New Avengers too with Brian Michael. Brian Michael Bendis is not a good example, but I did.
Or Alan Moore, don't use his.
But I was able to kind of understand at that point. I don't, like you said, you don't need to tell the artist so much. Of course, Steve McNiven was the artist, so you don't need to tell the artist so much. It was McNiven, right?
It was McNiven.
Yeah, the artist so much to let him or her understand and bring, like he said, their take to the art. Just like when you make a movie, you have a script, Steven Spielberg takes it and he puts his spin on it because he's the director. And just like in a comic, your artist puts their spin on your script. But we want to talk more about crafting stories, right?
Yeah.
So what do you got for us?
Yeah. Does anybody have specific questions they're having a challenge on where to start, where you're crafting your story?
Oh, so you have the middle act and the second and third act, but not a first act. Sometimes you can start a story in the middle, man, and it's
True. Maybe you found your start.
yeah.
Yeah.
And if you need to fill in those details, flashbacks.
So his question was for everybody, like, where do you start your story? He kind of has a middle and an end. He has that figured out, just he didn't know where to go from the beginning. So
I mean, you
that might be his beginning.
you don't have to follow that structure of first act, second act, third act all the time. Like you said, you can do it. Has anybody seen the movie American History X? It's a great movie. A lot of that movie is told in flashback.
Yeah.
The first it opens pretty much in the middle of the story with this heinous act this kid does, and then it flashes back to before that, to when he's in jail, and then the present day. I think that was a great narrative. The movie works perfectly in my book. It can be done, you know.
Yeah.
What is it you think you're missing that you think needs to go in a beginning that you don't have? Is it like an origin that you think you're missing or something like that?
Bye, David.
But you don't necessarily always have to explain that, as long as you can communicate who the characters are through their actions and their interactions with other characters. I don't think you have to have that, and as Martin pointed out, if you get to a point where you have something that pops in your head while you're writing, because that will happen if you're actually doing the writing, flashback. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and again, your character, if you're trying to establish character, you have the story, like you say, you start in the middle, and through conversations, through dialogue, through different actions they do, you can establish everything you need to know about the characters without having to go, Timmy was born through a poor family living in a mine. That can just all be told in dialogue as the story moves forward.
And if you're having trouble at any point in the story at the beginning, or if you get writer's block, if that's a real thing, what works for me is just to write, even if it sucks, even if what I'm writing doesn't make sense, write through it, and it'll come together, because as you're writing, your brain is going to take over, your subconscious, your conscious brain, they're going to take over and work through those problems that you're having with the story while you're sleeping, while you're driving, showering, working, whatever, and you're going to have ideas that pop up. But if you're starting in the middle, start in the middle and write that, and then maybe the ideas for the beginning will come to you then. But I think it's easy to hesitate when you get to a point where your ideas aren't what you think they should be at that point. But for me, I always make myself just write when I do that. Like I said, even if I think it's awful, just get it down. And when I come back to it, one, it's usually not as awful as I think it is, and usually there's some seeds of great ideas in there to help you move forward with your story, and sometimes great ideas that you just need to flesh out and maybe put at the beginning. So.
Well, let me ask this. I'm going to ask this. We're going to talk about this. Kevin, I'm going to get over. David left. He's got to run the show. When crafting your story, do you do a breakdown? Do you do a plot breakdown? You know what a plot breakdown is, where you break down, this is in the first act, these are the things that happen, second act and third act, and then you kind of write the story through. I do that sometimes. Do you do that?
Yeah, I'm religious about it, actually. I do it. Now, initially, I'm just going to do some blurbs, like a few paragraphs about what the story is, just for my reference, because particularly when writing a comic script, just to make sure that I'm consistent with the story I'm telling, with the characteristics of the characters, with their arcs, where I want them to get to individually. I write a story Bible. So for each character, I plot out the general arcs that I want to happen. I want them to go from this point to that point. For the story itself, I'll actually outline the major story points that I have in mind. And then, because it's a comic, I'm going to break it down by issue, if it's multiple issues, and then I'm going to break it down by page, per issue. So, because that just helps with pacing. Comics are all about pacing. You want when people flip the page for them to anticipate what's on that next page. So what we call the flip, that last panel on the right-hand page, you want that to pull them into the next page. This doesn't always have to be anything earth-shattering, but you want to pace your book that way. And I'll even include information on the flips on those page descriptions, just so that I know where I'm going with that. And it'll change as I'm writing, but having that story Bible, where I want to go with each character, with the overall story and the breakdowns by book and by page, it's invaluable. It makes the writing process easier and a lot better. But I'm not married to it.
Sure.
When I get ideas as I'm writing, then I'll change it if I need to. And by the end, sometimes the whole thing is different. But I'm still referencing that original story Bible because I want that to shape what I'm doing, even if the story has diverged.
Yeah. You brought up something too that a lot of cinema nowadays you don't see. Character story arc. If the characters aren't changed by the end of your story, cut the character. It's not needed. Characters need to grow and seem like they're real people. I see it a lot in genre fiction in theater mostly, where the characters are pretty much the same at the end of the story as they were at the beginning of the story.
As an example, I'm sure everybody saw Avengers Endgame, right?
Oh, don't bag on Endgame, dude. Everybody loves this movie.
How many of you also saw Dark Phoenix?
Have you seen the box office? Nobody saw Dark Phoenix.
I saw it. Well, one of the differences and the reason people want to see Endgame versus Dark Phoenix is that by the end, I won't spoil anything because people go crazy about spoilers, but Cap, totally different. Iron Man, totally different. Thanos, totally different. Just go down the line for almost every one of the main characters. If you go to Dark Phoenix, maybe one character is totally different by the end. There's some cool stuff that happens visually in that movie, but you don't care about 90% of the characters. Even if I'm invested in Nightcrawler since 1979, I don't care. It's cool to watch him teleport around and do awesome stuff, but he has no story. There's nothing that happens with him except that he's cool.
Right.
And so you care. I want to see the Endgame again because I love these story arcs. And Dark Phoenix, I don't know that I'll ever watch that again, except for the last action scene, just because it was fun. And that's the difference. Because really, in great movies and movies that blow up the box office versus those that don't, it's the character arcs. It's with caring about the characters.
Right. Another prime example of that. Anybody Star Trek fans in here? Any Star Trek? Okay. If you watch, a prime example of character arcs is Star Trek Deep Space Nine. You don't have to watch all 7 years of the show. But if you watch the first episode of the show and the last episode of the show, every single character is 100% different than when the show started. And they granted they had 7 years to do it, but they've all grown and changed. If you watch Star Trek Voyager, all the characters are exactly as they were in the first episode and the last episode.
And look at the fandoms for the two different shows, and there are people that love DS9 deeply, love and defend DS9. People still love Babylon 5, and if you watch that show, it looks like I made it on a computer yesterday, but it's still an amazing show because of the character arcs. It's just amazing. Yeah. It's just like you watch it on high def TV, and it's like, what are those things supposed to be? But it's still an amazing show because of the character arcs. JMS wrote really great character arcs.
And I think, I know we're beating the drum hard. I really think that's the key to good storytelling. Mm-hmm. Whatever your great high concept is, if there aren't good quality characters living in it, it's just a high concept.
Game of Thrones. How many character arcs are in Game of Thrones? 30, 40 different character arcs that run through it.
Sure.
And granted, they may have gotten less invested the last few years of the series, but they were still there. And people still cared right into the last episode, even if they griped about how they were handled in the last season.
Sure.
You cared.
But you griped because you cared.
Because they made you care.
But anybody have any questions before we jump into something else? We'll go you first, then you next.
So I'm writing a novel. I've been working on it for years, and it started as fanfic, but then it morphed into something loud. So I really like the idea of storyboard, because I got to the point where I'd write 20, 30 pages and then come a new idea, and then I'd have to scratch all 30 papers. So what I started is a storyboard. I know where I start, I know where I end, and I know the high points I need to get. So the biggest problem that's stopping me is connecting the dots.
Right.
So it's
the in-between.
Yeah, because my character's at A, he needs to get to C, but I don't know, it's nothing that you guys can just impart just some knowledge and vague stuff, because I just that's where I'm really struggling right now, because it's gotten to the point where I have A, I have Z, I have M, and I have lots of letters in between, but there's 3 spots that are just oh my god, I don't know how to connect it, and if I can't connect it, then I'm never going to start.
Well, this is where I'll give the horrible advice that I already told David you shouldn't do. You said it was originally based on another property.
Yeah.
Go back and watch that property, see how they did it, and maybe you can get inspiration from that. Don't copy it, obviously.
Right.
But get that's just a piece of advice. I'm sure there's other options.
Learn from the storytelling, as he's talking about. There's a lot to be learned from watching things that work, that you enjoy, without sniping it. You know, I mean.
Well, there's two things I would say though. Speaking of fan, I once published a book. I probably shouldn't talk about this. I once published a book before I had ever seen Firefly, because it got canceled so fast. And it wasn't until I saw Firefly that I realized this dude ripped everything off Firefly. So be careful when you starting with fan fiction. It still could be in there. Make sure you weed that out.
I have drifted so far from it, because like I started when I was in high school, a little beyond high school now, but like it started as that, but like it's like you can't even compare it now. It's like so different.
But now this is going to be something horrible I probably shouldn't say. But I don't know how old you are, but I'm assuming high school wasn't last year. Right. I know for myself, in a 3-year period, I've grown so much as a writer. So if you wrote chapter 1 4 or 5 years ago, it probably sucks compared to chapter 10 at this point. I don't really advise spending that much time working on something, because you're going to grow and change. Once you finish putting it all together, go back and rewrite it with your current eyes, because you're going to see, oh my God, I was such a child. Because life experience changes you 100%.
But as far as connecting the dots, I'll reiterate what I said earlier. Just write. Fill in the gaps with something, just the first idea you get, and then come back and rewrite that part once you have it all together. Just write it, because otherwise you're going to lose the important parts that surround the parts you're not sure about. That's
great advice. This is a totally weird topic to bring up. Michael Jackson. Kids are like, who's Michael Jackson?
That's weird.
It is. But one of his CDs has a bunch of the original demo tracks when he was putting the songs together. And I think it was one of his songs. I can't remember what it was. But you listen to the demo track, certain lyrics are the same. And then there's spots in the song he's just like beatboxing or freestyling, filling the gap, knowing he's going to go back in and write it. So like he says, fill those gaps with something. And then when you go back for your rewrite, that's what I got to change. That's what I got to change.
Well, anytime you listen to studio demos for most musical artists, I've got a box set of Nirvana, and like Smells Like Teen Spirit, and there's another one that everybody knows. I can't think of the title of it off the top of my head, but if you listen to the lyrics from the demos, they're totally different than what you heard on the radio.
Because they're just filling the holes.
Yeah, they're just filler. And then he came back and said this sounded better, and a lot of that's miscellaneous gibberish anyway. That's just his writing style, but it just sounded better what ended up on the studio album. But he just did filler to get the important parts, the tune, the melody, all that down. It's the same with writing. Get it down and then come back and fix it, because your brain you'll be surprised at the solutions it gives you over time once you've actually gone through the process of writing, because that's a creative process that fires off parts of your brain that are going to still be working on that when you're not consciously thinking about it.
Okay. You got a question, ma'am?
Working my way into plotting, but I'm working on a trilogy, and the world that I'm building has got this history that keeps just growing, and I'm wondering if you can speak to plotting a series versus like a standalone, because I'm stuck in, I'm not really writing right now because I'm trying to figure out what exactly I want to say over the course of these novels.
How are you getting that down? How are you recording those ideas for your world?
I have a notebook, and I mostly write in that.
Wow. Hand stuff.
Yeah, mostly. But I mean, I kind of, it's multimedia, but right now I'm taking notes and just like sitting with it and thinking through. But, the story that I'm trying to tell keeps growing, but I'm not exactly sure how I want the plotting to go.
Well, you have an overall idea of what you want the story to be about.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a good start right there. What would you say then? The characters should populate that story after that?
Yeah. What I would do is take your notes, and then I would start organizing them per what you want for each character, what you want for each setting. I don't know if it's a fantasy or sci-fi setting, but if there's certain worlds or cities or fortresses or whatever that are the settings, then I would take and just start putting descriptions of those from your notes, detailed descriptions in a Word document, organizing it that way, and the story's going to come to you. I would also suggest just writing some short stories based on the settings or the certain characters, so you get an idea of how you want them to be, the voice that you want to use as the writer for that. And just as an experiment, start small in terms of your actual story writing, start big in terms of your story Bible, and it'll come to you.
Well, but again, to that I'd also say, and this may be just a different way of looking at it. I'm not saying I'm right and anything's wrong, but like just Star Wars, we all seen Star Wars. The Death Star. Did George Lucas want to write a story that's set in outer space about this tyrannical space government who had a giant space weapon, or did he want to write a story about people and they needed something to go destroy? They needed. So when you're building your world, make sure you put things in there that are for the story and for the characters to do. Because if you're like, well, I'm going to build this fortress, I'm going to build this and this and this, now I have to find a way to force my story to fit these environments. Every now and then it's okay to, well, I had this idea for a fairyland, but it doesn't fit, throw it away, use it, save it for something else. Because if the things you're creating don't build the story and don't build the narrative of the story, then you're just kind of writing an encyclopedia more so than you're writing a story, in my opinion. I mean, there's different ways to look at it. I know people are strict with their Bibles and whatnot, story Bibles, out said. But as far as, you can't be too regimented with that. You need to be able to cut things and reform the world to fit the story instead of trying, in my opinion, instead of forcing your story to fit the world. That's just my opinion.
I think one thing you'll notice that we're talking about a lot is flexibility. Before and during your writing process, and Martin's right. I mean, I would flesh out that Bible as much as you want to, and feel free to cut, as he points out. But the more you flesh that out, the more background you're going to have as the writer that's going to inform the voices of the characters and your voice as to however you're narrating the story. And then you don't have to actually mention those things, but it's there, and it fills out your world a lot better. But definitely don't, as he points out, you can do too much. I mean, not to be grandiose about it, but Tolkien and Herbert wrote glossaries for their books. I mean, they basically did write encyclopedias, but they were writing how many volumes, how many pages of
But the question is, did they write their encyclopedias while they were creating the story, or did they write them? I think you got them. Or did they write them before did they write them while they're creating their story, or did they write them before? That's the question. Do we even know?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I would guess they did at least some of that before, because the worlds are so intricate. Not everybody can do that, and not everybody should do that in terms of being that intricate. But in terms of story crafting, for me, that's what works for me. But I am not afraid to kill things to just get them out so they don't end up in the story.
And that goes for characters too. Sometimes, this character is my mom. I worked her into the story, but she doesn't do anything to move the narrative along. Especially in comics where your landscape is very tight. You gotta go, Mom. Sorry, you're not in this book. Maybe the next one. And sorry, you have to. What they call it? Like killing your darling, murdering your babies, killing your darling, something like that. Anyways, any more questions before we make up something? Yes, sir. Yeah, I mean, I can't hear crap. What was that? It's fiction. You don't have to.
I don't care.
Yeah, you don't
honestly
have to.
don't care. When people start criticizing movies and things for not being scientifically accurate, it baffles me. I don't want to watch the Discover Channel when I'm watching Star Wars or Lord of the Rings.
Right.
I want to see, fantastical things that carry my imagination somewhere instead of sitting there picking something apart because Einstein didn't come up with it or verify it. I mean,
to use Star Trek as an example, and this is flip side of that as well. Star Trek has transporters. They beam people. That's never going to happen. It's just the technology is just so fanciful.
That could actually happen. Yeah.
Break down your molecules and reassemble them out of other molecules.
Done actual teleportation of atoms.
Christ.
Yes, it's actually happening.
That's insane. Warp speed's never going to be possible.
Also possible.
Oh, damn it!
Star Trek's a little different because
we're never going to have communicator.
Flip phones.
Okay, Star Wars.
We've actually moved beyond flip phones.
Hey, but the point I was trying to make is when you set up these fanciful lightsabers.
Kylo Ren's lightsaber, the dumbest argument of all time that it won't work. Who cares? I don't care about the hilts. Just it's awesome to look at, but so many people got upset over it because it wouldn't work. I don't care. It's awesome. I don't.
But
nothing in
lightsabers.
Star Wars is going to work.
That's the thing. Lightsabers
Force
don't
isn't
work.
real.
Yeah. But again, the flip side. Maybe this might conflict that a little bit. If you make up your fantasy, you make up your science, but once you've made it up and your characters have done A, B, and C, they can't do E because you've set your rules. And as the author, as the writer, you don't set this on Earth. You can set your rules. Your rules are what they are. But once you set your rules are set. You need to stick to it. That's at least my philosophy.
Yeah, nothing's more enraging in comics than to have characters suddenly have powers they didn't have before, or use them in ways that didn't work before just because a new writer showed up.
Right.
And sometimes they can be innovative with that and make it cool, but sometimes they just do it as a plot device, as dudes like Machina, just to get something done. Yeah, and,
sure.
And then it's like, you lost me.
Right.
But otherwise, the rules are important. Every story has its own rules. Books of Magic has its own rules. Doctor Strange, they actually have made rules for Doctor Strange who before could just do whatever. But in the movies, he has very specific rules about how his magic works. They're different from the comics, but in the movies, it's consistent across his movie and the Avengers movies that he appears in and so forth. And that's what makes it fun, because you can anticipate, what his limits are, what he can and can't do. And so he's defined, and you understand when he gets in a situation where he can't use his powers, you know why.
You create something and you set rules for it, and that's kind of like easy for you. But also, your creation is partly the readers and how they interpret it. So being able to kind of have enough to base it on so the reader understands, but also the reader can put their own twist on it, their own perspective.
Yeah, you're saying leave it open for the reader to figure and interpret a certain level of things out. Most definitely. But like we were saying, you don't have to explain everything. However, okay, she was saying that the reader is as much involved to a degree in the story as the author. So you're setting the rules, but the reader might understand the rules to be differently, correct? And it happens, but ultimately you're still the writer. It's your world. What do you think?
I agree. Yeah, I think it's good to have different interpretations of the work from different readers. That's inevitable, but as long as the writer stays consistent with what they're trying to communicate. And certainly you can make twists as if they're real story developments. It's going to keep the quality of your story high rather than just spontaneously changing something for your own convenience to make it easy to change the plot. But if you write it into your story as a real development, change what you want to change.
But I mean, obviously none of us are at the level of, say, a Star Wars. But to a degree, I'll say this, and maybe people might disagree with me. I think Kevin is about to. George Lucas made the first 3 Star Wars films, 4, 5, and 6. He made 1, 2, and 3. A lot of people didn't like it. It's still his story. He created it, and then he didn't give fans what they wanted, which is okay. You don't always have to give fans subvert expectations. And a lot of people say they enjoyed the J.J. Abrams one, where all they did was give fans what they wanted. But is it as an enjoyable film experience when you're just getting everything you want as a fan? I don't know. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, clearly people enjoyed that one more than the prequels. Although I think that's changing. I think a lot of the prequels are getting a lot of love these days because the people that grew up with those are young adults now, and there's a lot of love for those movies. But
who didn't grow up with that fan expectation of what they were going to get?
I think there are bigger problems with the prequels than that George wasn't trying to, deliver fan service.
I'm just using that as an example.
But I get it. But he did change his own rules in that. But he did it in story. We joke about midichlorians, but that was just a deeper explanation. It came up during the story. It wasn't exposition. It wasn't in the crawl at the beginning, and then you're just, here's the thing about midichlorians. And
we as fans are like, what is this? We don't like that. But it's his world. It's his rules.
It's a doofy idea when you get down to it. But again, it is his. I felt like it was executed okay in the terms of the story. And I noticed they did not carry that forward
of course
in the newer movies.
Because at least Episode 7 was exactly what every fan, I want to see Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon. Here you go. I want to see this. Here you go. Yeah. I think we're actually got to wrap up now. We're at the 5-minute mark. I'll say this. You guys want to be writers. You guys want to support other writers. We're writers. We got 2 tables out here. Please check out our work. And everybody here, they're amazing creators. But please check us out. Kevin's right, 5 tables down. I'm 7 tables down. So please come check us out at our booths. Inverse Press, Cosmic Times, that's who we are. We hope you guys got a little something out of the panel. I think we did.
This was fun.
Then come see us at our booth if you have some more questions. All right? Take care, everybody. Hey, I hope you liked this panel we recorded at InfinityCon Tallahassee. We have a lot of other great stuff up on our YouTube channel. Make sure you check that out. And of course, visit CosmicTimes.net for more information about all the awesome stuff happening at Cosmic Times. And make sure you check out InversePress.com to see what Kevin's up to. Stay cosmic, everybody.